All right, we're 2 minutes past now, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully, everyone had a chance to join. So, just to reiterate, this is the webinar by the podcast consultant called 10 Essential Steps to Launch Your Podcast. And we'll be breaking down the 10 most critical steps in starting a successful show. Before we start, I just want to let everyone know that in the Q&A panel, you can put any questions you have. And at the end, we're going to have about a 15-minute Q&A discussion. So put your questions there and then I'll answer them. If I don't get to your question for whatever reason, you can reach out to me personally at robert@thepodcastconsultant.com. So easy to remember. But yeah, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for joining us. All right. So just to let you guys know what the agenda is, um, what we're going to be talking about in this webinar is, like we said, 10 things. First, developing your podcast concept, understanding your audience, podcast format options, naming your podcast descriptions, your podcast trailer strategy, uh, technical setup basics like mics, headphones, cameras, all that stuff. Uh, Audio branding for your consistent intros and outros. We'll do visual branding and design, and finally, distribution platforms. So let's get into it. I want to introduce myself a little bit. I'm a very experienced podcast producer, and it's funny to say, but I've done over 1,000 episodes. I've been with a podcast consultant since 2019, where I started as the editor. I am now the launch consultant. So, kind of what I'm doing today is what I do on a more personal and customized level, of course, for people when they sign up for our launch program. So, you're kind of getting the inside tips and tricks on that. And it's a great way to get started. I've been featured in the New York Times and Forbes for some of the stuff I've worked on and developed and launched dozens of shows for different organizations throughout my time at the podcast consultant so far. So let's get that out of the way and we can get started. So the first thing is developing your podcast concept. Now, since you guys are joining us for this specific webinar, I'm guessing that you have some sense of what your podcast concept is, but a lot of people don't go in depth as much as they should when they start the show, and they have more of a broad idea of what a podcast is, but they don't really get into all the nitty-gritty details that will help. And so I want to talk a little about that today. Very specific. Uh, the way I like to say is kind of what keeps you up at night? What are you thinking about? What kind of topics could you talk about for hours and hours without getting bored, without running out of things to say? That's kind of the sweet spot for your podcast concept. But yeah, when developing your podcast, like you kind of want to focus on three critical elements. Um, something you're passionate about. Like I said, choose a topic that you genuinely are interested in, that you genuinely love, and that you can talk about forever. Because, a podcast can go for years. So you want to make sure there's like an infinite amount of things you can say about any given topic. Um, Whatever your expertise is really important. So what perspective are you bringing to the table that's unique and gives you authority to speak on the subject matter? And then your audience needs is something that people miss a lot. You're not making the podcast just for you, although it might feel like that to begin with. You really want to craft everything towards what your audience might want and what they're looking for. So when you're developing your concept, that's a really important thing. And I think that's something that people miss a lot because they don't really think about their audience because they don't have an audience yet. But I would say also to brainstorm topics. But yeah, it's really important to define your unique angle, consider what like your expertise and your perspective can bring. Um, that really makes it stand out because there's whatever your podcast is about, there are surely many other podcasts that are covering the same thing. So it's important to make sure that you are leading first with your expertise and your background. And that's a great way to separate yourself from the rest. Um, Like I said, it's good to brainstorm specific topics, but you don't have to get too detailed. Just a broad sense of like, here are a few different things I could cover to start off with. And then as you go on, you'll develop like better ideas and more ideas. But just to get started, it's nice to have some of those topics. You want to create, again, like your unique selling proposition. So identify what sets your podcast apart. And again, it's really got to be something that you are passionate about because that really shows. And again, understanding your audience is really important. So we'll talk a little bit about that. You can get really specific. It is good to be as granular as possible when you're coming up with, your ideal struggling with, what are they hoping to learn or hoping to experience by listening to your podcast. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, an ideal customer profile in any business. That's a popular thing. But in podcasting, it's no different, really. We call it like technically the ideal listener profile or the ideal viewer profile, but it's the same concept. You can even try to think about like their age range, their interests, their pain points, listening habits. Having a detailed listener persona is really going to give you a better sense of how to target that specific audience. And again, you want to start off niche. And then when you start to think about your audience, the more the specific, the better. And it's easier to find your audience that way because you know where to look and you know who you're dealing with. So yeah, like you don't have to get as granular as, age range, etc. But I think it will help if you can. So like if you definitely are shooting for like, a retired demographic or a teen demographic or a college demographic, it might come in handy when you're trying to plan out your podcast concept and then develop your ideal audience. So I do think that that's something that people miss all the time, especially when I'm launching shows. When I ask people about that, they sometimes just haven't even thought about it. So it's good for you guys when you are developing your concept to really zero in on that, and it will help you develop your ideas better and potential guests, all sorts of stuff. Like it all kind of derives from that. All right, so we're gonna move on to the next one here, and that's podcast format options. So it's easy for people to get overwhelmed here, but there is an infinite amount of different podcast formats. Um, Typically, like I recommend the people who are just starting off in podcasting, they do one of these few that we're going to talk about today. The first being solo episodes. So, a pro there is that it's full control. So you don't have to worry about a guest like going off the rails or not having anything to talk about. It's really good for people who have a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge that they want to give the listener. So it's also good for people who are great storytellers. So I always say like you could do a solo episode if you're the type of person who at a dinner party can hold a conversation and everyone's listening to you and paying attention to you. I think that's where it is best. That's the type of person who is best suited for a solo episode. But a lot of times, people who are very thoughtful and have a lot of information are really good at doing like monologues. So, like, if you're, say, not necessarily a person who can hold the attention of, a dinner party, you can write everything out the same way that you would, like a conference speech or something. And those are just as effective. So, the personality type doesn't necessarily matter, but I always just use that as a reference for a starting point. One thing I will say in general, it's nice to have the ability to do solo episodes because, as you will certainly find out when you start trying to book guests, there's always a time where somebody gets sick or somebody's kids get sick or they can't make it for whatever reason. And then you're kind of stuck with not being able to put out an episode. So I always recommend coming up with some sort of concept that you can do on your own. So just when worst comes to worst, you'll have something to put out. Because as we'll talk about later, release cadence is actually very important because listeners form listening habits. So say every Wednesday morning somebody listens when they're going to work. And so that's like kind of their ritual for their commute is they listen to your podcast. If all of a sudden a guest cancels and then you're not available, then they're just going to move on because there's literally, I think, 18 million podcasts are currently active right now. So they'll just move on and they'll kind of forget about you. So it's important to have that as kind of a backup. So I just think it's a good tip to keep in your back pocket in case you ever need to. But there are, of course, many other formats. So the interview format, this is probably what most podcasts are, basically interviews, two people talking. Again, the guest thing can trip people up sometimes, so that's why I always mention the solo episodes. But it's really great to have a conversation versus a monologue sometimes. If your audience isn't the type of audience who's looking for very specific information, and very detailed information, they more just like want to hear people talk. I know for me personally, like I learn better when I'm hearing people either in discussion or debate. I seem to like pick up more information that way than just like a straight monologue episode. But it's different for everybody, and that's why it's important to know your audience. It's also gives you a chance to get like diverse perspectives. It's also great for networking. One tip that I always give people when they're considering podcast growth is to strategically pick your guests because you can pick guests who say already have their own podcast and already have their own podcast audience, and you kind of are tapping into their audience as well. And especially if they're willing to promote it, which is something we'll be able to talk about later. And I will actually be referencing a previous webinar that I did that talks a lot about that and goes into depth about how networking with other guests is really like a great way to grow your show and to grow your audience. But that's pretty much it. Everyone knows how it goes. Usually it's just very conversational. I will say that there's a little bit of a nuance between a conversation and an interview. So when you are thinking about your concept and planning out your episodes, that's something to think about too. Some hosts will create specific questions and they might, give the guests the questions ahead of time. And those tend to be a little bit more rigid conversations, but you ensure that you cover everything that you want to cover versus a conversational style where you don't necessarily know what's going to come up, but you know that the guest can talk about, a broad range of topics and you have a general sense and they might surprise you and they might surprise your audience about what you end up talking about. And that's always kind of a fun experience. So those are the two most basic formats that you guys are probably all pretty familiar with. Moving on from there, we have panel discussions. I will say panel discussions can be a little bit tricky when you're new to podcasting because if you don't format it in the correct way, it can kind of be like a lot of people are talking over each other, kind of like, to use the dinner table metaphor again, if you have a big family and everyone's kind of talking over each other and people like have their own side conversations, it can be difficult to navigate. So I would say when you do have panel discussions to try to like make it as structured as possible. So you might want to, as the host, kind of act as an intermediary between everyone and let one person share, let take the next person and then get their perspective and then contrast it, and then you'll be off on a discussion that way. Technically, it can be tricky when you're doing that too, because you're having multiple microphones. And if you're doing it remotely, there can always be like connectivity issues and stuff like that. So you really want to be careful when you're planning those out that you put as much time and effort into both the formatting and the structure of it, but also the technical side of like how you're going to get multiple people together in one room or whether that's remotely. But the benefits of having the panel discussions that you get multiple viewpoints, so you get a really diverse array of like different opinions, which again I think like helps the audience learn more, and it might help you learn more too. And as far as like networking, the more guests that you have, the more networking that you can do. So you have a big opportunity there. It's also really good to cover really complex, nuanced topics because, like I said, you have a variety of opinions. So those are kind of like the big three. And then of course there is a hybrid approach. And that's kind of what I was referencing before is that you can have multiple formats, and I think having in your back pocket like that solo episode format is really good as a just in case. But also doing a panel discussion one week, having a solo episode one week, having an interview uh, Q&A style one week, um, it really makes it more diverse to listen to and it makes it more fun for the audience. So it's not like the same thing every time. A lot of people do want the same thing every time. If you're really good at doing interviews, then they really, want to dive into those. But it's worth thinking about to keep your content fresh and engaging to be able to mix and match those formats. So that's just something to think about as you are starting to develop your format options. All right, so moving on. One of the most important things, obviously, the first thing everyone thinks about, kind of one of the more fun things, is naming your podcast. I will say a lot of people who come to us to do a launch, they have an idea in mind and they're really excited about it. But then they find out that there's 12 other podcasts that have pretty much the same name. So one thing I would recommend, and this is one of the resources that we'll put in the chat and in the follow-up, which, by the way, any of the resources that we are linking, you're going to be getting an email probably 24 hours or less after the conference that has all of these resources and links. So don't worry about trying to get in the chat and copy and paste it right away because we'll be providing that and I will recap it at the end. But one of the best ways to check to see if your podcast name is actually already taken is a site called podnews.net. And what it does is basically it will scrub all of the different podcast platforms and use your name as a keyword, and it will bring up anything that's like similar. And so a lot of times you'll find that there's 3 or 4 podcasts that have like a similar name. And if you're really tied to that name, what you can do is make a variation on it. So a lot of times that's what happens when people end up doing their launch. They'll add, the company presents whatever the title of the podcast is, or the blah, blah, blah podcast with host. So that's one way that you can kind of like keep your idea going. The other thing that people have an issue with when they first come to me and they have a name in mind is they don't really have an idea about how to make the title easy for the listener to understand what it is right away. So you want to make it as direct as possible so that when people read the name of your podcast, they can kind of like, oh, I know what that is. That's the investing podcast, that's the financial podcast, that's the sports podcast. So people tend to get like very creative with your name, which is great, but you can get it to be so creative that it's hard to find. So like if you're using like a portmanteau or like alternative spellings, like a Z instead of an S, that's just going to lead to trouble for you down the line when people like are looking for it. A lot of podcasts are spread through word of mouth. So someone might just say the name of the podcast and you won't necessarily have the spelling. So that's something that's really important to think about. And searchability in general is something that you want to think about. And also like uniqueness, because like I said, there are 18 million podcasts currently. So whatever you're thinking about your podcast is going to be, there's probably, a lot of other podcasts covering it, and they might even have the same name. So uniqueness is really good. But like I said, you can always make a variation just to keep that. If you do have trouble coming up with a name that fits, and say like you ask your friends and family and you guys just really can't come to a conclusion, there is another really nice resource that we will also link and send in the email. So the company Riverside, who does remote recording, kind of like Zoom, they have a really fun thing called the podcast name generator, where basically you can put in some keywords, kind of describe what your podcast is about, and it will use AI to spit out a bunch of different names. Now, not everyone like finds that it gives you the perfect name, but it might spark some ideas for you. So it's something to think about if you're having trouble naming the show. But yeah, just to reiterate, so audience appeal, making sure that it's something that the audience knows right away what it is. And sometimes it's helpful, especially if you've already defined your audience and you know the niche, to kind of include keywords or buzzwords or industry words that would right away give some familiarity. Tone alignment, if you're doing a comedy podcast, you can kind of have a joke in there or something or a pun. I think that's fine. But if you're going for a really serious tone, like if it's a financial podcast or something that represents your business, you want to make sure that the tone aligns with your messaging of your company in general. Um, Searchability, just make sure it's easy to find if you type it into a search engine. And we'll talk about how to do that a little bit later. And then uniqueness, like I said. All right, so we'll move on to the next one here. Some do's and don'ts. Make sure that it does reflect your content. Make sure that it's short and memorable. I see a lot of times people have really long podcast names, and honestly, like on a lot of podcast platforms, it's just going to get cut off anyways. So I usually say if you can to keep it to like under 6 words or so, and you don't always need to add the at the beginning and podcast or show at the end. People know that it's a podcast. People know that it's a show. So if you're trying to shorten it, I would definitely keep that in mind. And again, yeah, don't use complex spelling. Don't choose like overly generic stuff because there is going to be probably 2 or 3 podcasts that already have a more generic name. So, all right. So, podcast description is the next thing. So, what's really important to think about is in general, crafting your elevator pitch, which I think everyone knows what that means, but basically, how do you describe your podcast in the time that it takes to go from floor 1 to floor 3? So what you want to focus on doing is explaining the show's concept, highlighting the listener values. So what do they actually get out of listening to the show? And then again, showcase the host credentials. So you want to make sure that they know your background and why you have expertise and authority to speak on the matter. Kind of like why should they listen to you? What are they going to get? What's the show is all about? Now, the podcast description that I'm referring to specifically is kind of what lives on your podcast feed's homepage. So when you go to any podcast's homepage, like on any podcast platform, it's usually like in an about section, like on Spotify or Apple. You have about 300 characters before an ellipses or like a see more button has to be clicked to see the rest of it. I think you can do up to like 4,000 characters depending on platform. But you really want to keep it short anyway. I mean, that's kind of why we call it an elevator pitch because it should be short and sweet. But yeah, so try to keep it to about 300 characters, which is usually like a few sentences, less than a paragraph. But be very specific and kind of use like your own personality when you're writing it so that it reflects kind of like who the host is as well. And then try to create some kind of intrigue. But the biggest thing is like explain the concept, highlighting the values, and then kind of showcasing your unique credentials and expertise. That's the biggest thing. When you write out your podcast description, it's going to be very helpful to have that language because it will be used multiple places. And we're going to kind of get into where those multiple places are next. So podcast trailer strategy. And why I say the podcast description language is helpful because when you are scripting your trailer, a lot of times what people will do is basically have it be an extended version of what they've written in their description and kind of like use that as the extended version of what the script will be for your trailer. Trailers are usually only about 2 to 3 minutes, so it doesn't have to be that long, but it's going to be longer than your podcast description, ideally. It gives you a chance to like introduce yourself, but explain a little bit more about your background. Personally, I think it's really important to be as specific about your background and your experience when you're explaining who you are and what your story is, because a lot of times that's the biggest thing that makes people want to listen to a podcast is like your specific expertise, your specific perspective. So be personal. Tell people, if it's that you have like 30 years in the finance industry, that were a sports writer for 15 years, that you wrote for the New York Times, that you're an author, that you're an artist, whatever it might be. I think the trailer is a great place to kind of like explain who you are, because usually people coming in and finding your podcast for the first time, that's going to be the most appealing for them. But yeah, and then just talk about what the podcast purpose is. A lot of times, people, if they've already recorded episodes, will tease upcoming content. So you could either mention, these are the guests I'm going to have, guest A, guest B, guest C, or you can actually take little clips of each show and incorporate those into the trailer. That's always really a nice, fun thing to do, and it sounds good overall. But yeah, so overall, focus on what listeners can expect and what they will gain from listening, like what the value add is. Um, so like I said, the trailers will be displayed basically the same place that the podcast description is. So you'll see in the about section will be the description, and then above that usually there'll be the trailer. So it won't actually be in the episode feed; it'll be above. So that's actually the first thing that people are going to see. The trailer is also very helpful to use as a promotional item. So, like, once you have the trailer recorded, that's a lot of times what people use as the announcement. So, when they're announcing the show on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on Twitter, whatever it might be, it's really nice to have that resource. Additionally, it can be used as the homepage for your website when you get your podcast website set up. And then, if you are doing welcome page on YouTube, and then video trailers can be displayed also on Spotify. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to the podcasting distribution platforms. But yeah, that's basically it for the podcast trailer strategy. Um, so next thing is technical setup basics. So this is basically your microphones, your recording space. This is going to be really crucial to figure out as you figure out your concept. Because, like I said, if you're going to do a panel discussion, you're going to really need to figure out, like, well, how many microphones do I need, and what kind of interface do I need to plug those in, and what does the interface record to? Am I recording to a digital recorder? Am I going to record to my computer, and what's the benefits of that? I will say on our website, we have a lot of blogs that talk specifically about, all the different digital recorders and compare and contrast them. What's the best microphone for you in a specific situation? What's the best camera? Like, what's the best way to get good lighting? So, we will be including those in the email, some resources there, and I highly recommend you check those out. In general, I mean, it really varies, but like just about the equipment tiers, a budget setup is usually from, $1 to $300 if you're using the best practices. Mid-range setup will be between like start where you're at, and whatever you can afford, you can start there and then eventually you can upgrade. But don't be too intimidated by the equipment stuff. A lot of people have find that it's better for them to skip this step altogether and to just go to a place like where I am right now, which is a podcast studio. It's really affordable and it's so popular now that most major cities have multiple podcast studios, and you're usually only paying like 50 to $100 per session. It's kind of nice to be able to invite your guests to like a welcoming place, and then you can focus on the content versus worrying about, all the technical aspects. Although there is a lot of technology nowadays that makes it really easy. So I would say don't be too intimidated. And it's also good to have kind of a backup, like a mobile setup. If you're on the road and you are in your hotel room and you want invite someone from a conference to record with you. And also for remote recordings, it's nice to have something like I have here, which is just a basic USB mic. You can plug it into your laptop, and then wherever you are, you're good to go. Have a good set of headphones, and you're all set. So there's of course a lot more to talk about when we talk about technical setup basics, but I'm bringing it up today just so that you know when you're developing your concept that that's one of the most important things, that you can have whatever concept you want, but if you don't have the setup basics to get going with that, then you're never gonna get there. So yeah, lots more to talk about there as far as on our blogs and everything. So feel free to check that out. All right, so another place where your language of your podcast description is going to come in handy is when you do your intros and outros. And so you can kind of think of the intro and outro, or what we call static intro and outro, which is like you've all probably heard before on most podcasts, they have like a regular intro and a regular outro that's just the same every time. Kind of generic, just introduces the show. That is kind of like your audio branding. And a big part of that audio branding is going to be music. So you want to pick probably just one song that you will incorporate into your trailer, into your intro, and into your outro. And that kind of gives like that brand consistency. And I mean, there's a lot to say there, but music is very subjective. But I will say that you just want it, much like the name, to align with the tone of the show. So again, like if you're doing something really serious, maybe it's like a philosophy podcast or something, you maybe want like classical music or jazz. But if it's a more casual, kind of like fun conversational show, it can be pop music or rap music, rock music, whatever appeals to you. But it is good just to think about the tone there. There are plenty of royalty-free music sites where, for 20 to $50, you can license a piece of music to use and then not have to pay any royalty fees on it. I really recommend Envato, and we'll put that in the chat, and that'll be one of the resources that we send afterwards. Um, what's really great about Envato is it has a lot more to choose from than some of the other sites like Premium Beats or Pond5. And it actually has this really nice feature where you can copy and paste a song from Spotify or YouTube and paste it in, and it will spit out kind of like a bunch of different options that are similar. So, like something in that genre, something in the same key, something in the same tempo. And so, if you're having trouble getting started on finding music, I usually tell people like find a reference, a commercial music reference that you like, and then you can use that to kind of find licensable stuff. It is important to note that you really can't use copyrighted music in your podcast. Um, you can technically sometimes get away with it on YouTube, but they will demonetize you. However, with the platforms like Spotify and Apple, they will definitely flag that, and you can potentially have your show booted off. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you're getting those royalty-free music outlets. And they'll also provide like a license for you, so you'll have like a paper document that says, I can use this. But as far as the actual intro and outro, like I was saying, the language that you've written for your trailer and the language that you've written for your description are very useful. But there's really not a lot to an intro. So for video, we usually just recommend you just do a quick riff of music, your audio branded music, and you go straight into the intro. Because the analytics have showed with YouTube specifically on video podcasts, people want to go straight to the content. Um, as far as audio podcasts, you have a little bit more leeway there, but you should still be short, like under 20 seconds. And it's as simple as, welcome to the blank podcast where we dive deep into whatever subject. I'm your host, blah, blah, blah. A little bit of music plays, and then that's it. And then on every episode, that will be at the beginning, and that kind of gives you some brand consistency. The outro can be a little bit longer, and you have a little bit of audience capture there where you can do a call to action. So, what I would recommend is thinking about what you want people to do as the next step after listening. Like, oh, I really love this podcast. I would like to engage more. So, if you have a newsletter set up, if you have a website set up, if you have social media set up, it's really important that you say that in the outro. So it could be something like, thanks for listening to the blank podcast. For more tips and insights, follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter at blank. Um, One thing that you will always hear, and it's kind of become a cliche, but it's actually really important, is to say something like, if you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. So the reviews actually drive discovery in the algorithm on all of the podcast platforms. So when the podcast platforms decide to show somebody one of your shows as a suggestion, they are doing that based on, yes, how many downloads you have, but also how many reviews you have and the quality of the reviews. So it's really important, especially when you're starting off, that you get as many reviews as you can. And so that might just be friends and family right at first. But also, when you're searching the podcast in the podcast search field, the more reviews you have, the more likely it's going to come up first, or suggest when you're like halfway through typing the name of the show, it will suggest it, which is something you definitely want to have for discovery. So that's really important to think about. Yeah, so that's some of the intros and outros. best practices there. So move on. Take a sip of my, branded mug here. So continuing with the branding idea, visual branding and design is going to be very, very important. Um, Podcast cover art is the main asset that you're going to want to have. Um, it's something that really makes, the first impression of what the podcast is. So it's really important. Um, what you're going to want to make sure to do is use consistent fonts and consistent colors in the podcast art, the main podcast art, which is what's going to be displayed on the homepage of your feed. Um, Secondarily, you might want to think about doing episodic cover art, which is something that I always recommend. And so basically, once you have your design in place for the regular podcast art, you can make variations on that, like by creating a template. So typically, a show would have, uh, the font laid out, have the colors, and then have a picture of the host typically. And then so episodic cover art could be the same thing, except you replace the picture of the host with the guest, and then you're using the same font to write, the guest name. It really helps you stand out when people are looking at your podcast feed. It also helps them decide which episode they want to listen to, and it just looks a lot more professional. Um, you should definitely consider like the Apple Podcast specifications. So you can find that just by Googling it, and we can put it in the as a resource. But basically, that's one thing to keep in mind is people are usually looking at it on their phone. So it's a tiny, tiny square. So you want to make sure that it's like as bold as possible and that it's like really easy to read and kind of really colorful and really stands out. So this principle is super important when it comes to YouTube. So if you plan on doing YouTube videos, if you're doing a video podcast, it's a whole world about YouTube thumbnails. So basically, the only way that people decide which episode or which video they're going to click on is entirely based on the thumbnail. So if a lot of you guys have watched YouTube videos, you know that sometimes they tend to be like very attention grabby, very bold colors, very big font, just make it something that grabs them right away. It's a little bit less of an issue with the podcast feed because then you have like the description and everything, and the name and the title can be longer. But it's really important to think about that when you're doing YouTube thumbnails. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're doing your visual branding and design. But yeah, again, you want to keep the colors consistent and keep the font consistent. So on your website, on your social media profile, that you have all of the same colors and fonts, just makes it more recognizable for the audience and it's better for discovery overall. All right, so moving on to the next one here. Um, so there is a lot to say about distribution platforms, but starting off, they are all kind of the same. They all kind of do the same thing. So the distribution platforms is essentially where you go to create an account to create what's called an RSS feed. The RSS feed is what you use to submit to all the other podcast platforms. Um, so it's pretty basic as far as the essential idea of what a distribution platform does, but they all have different features and they all have different prices. But usually, when people come to us to launch a podcast for the first time, I will, at least as of late, in the past 2 or 3 years, I've been recommending Spotify for creators. And that's because they have a lot of really great features and it's completely free. Keep in mind, you can always switch your hosting platform, and nowadays it's pretty easy to switch from one to the other without having any interruptions in your feed. So if you start off on one and it doesn't have the features you need, or you want to expand in some way, and you're not able to do that with your current feed, then you can always do that. But what's nice about Spotify is it has video integration, which almost no other distribution platform actually has, and that's because every episode where you can ask a question and then people can answer in the comments. They just enabled commenting. They just enabled like emojis, so you can do a like or a happy face or a frowny face on podcasts now. That literally just started like within the month. And there's also really good demographics. So not every podcast hosting platform, which is where all the analytics are derived from, has like age and gender location, age, gender, and location. So it's really important, especially when you're trying to figure out who your audience is, that you have that kind of information to begin with. So it's just kind of like a really nice to have. Um, some of the other things, the other options that you might want to think about, like Captivate is one that has really good integration for like ads. So like dynamic ad insertion is the way that most people monetize their podcasts, which I'm sure you guys have heard, where it's just like whatever companies decide that they want to work with Captivate, they will basically think about which genre of podcast they want to promote to, and then you can basically do a little pin drop on your audio file and say, at 2 minutes and 30 seconds, you can put an ad, and it will automatically do that. Um, a lot of the other platforms do that, but what's nice about Captivate is that you can do your own. So say, you are doing a conference or you have something, an event or something that you want to promote, but you have an event coming up, in the next week. You have the ability to create your own ad and insert that and insert it on all of your previous episodes. And it's temporary, so you can take it out once the event is over. So there's like little nuances like that and different features. But typically, I would say start off with Spotify for creators because it's free, it has video integration, and it has great analytics. Um, but yeah, so that's mainly what we wanted to talk about today, and I still want to make time for questions. So let me get through the next few slides here. So yeah, just to reiterate what I was talking about before is that previously I have done a webinar about 10 proven podcast growth strategies. So that's up now on our YouTube channel. Um, and so it talks about increasing episode frequency, enhancing social media presence, optimizing show notes, titles, and art, leveraging email marketing, optimizing web presence, implementing calls to action, which we talked a little bit about, guest appearance strategy, which is what I was referencing before, leveraging Spotify, which I just got done talking about, optimizing for Apple Podcasts, and then regular analytics reviews, which is really important. You want to know how good a certain show is doing or how bad a certain show is doing when you're planning your next episodes. So I highly recommend that, once you've gotten your show launched, that you take a look at that to see how you can grow. So just some closing thoughts. Consistency is really key. Once you start, like I said, people focus on uh, they form listener habits. So it's really important that if you say you're going to put out every other Wednesday, that you keep to that. Again, like I said, like when you're about not being too intimidated about the microphones, start from where you are. If you just have like, one basic mic that's, a cheaper version, that's fine. Just get started and don't get like analysis paralysis where you're trying to figure out exactly everything and then you just get too stressed out and overwhelmed. Once you start your show, be patient, strategic, and vigilant. What a lot of people don't realize is it usually takes like a year or two of really consistent um, cadence release and then really pushing your show before you see any traction. Like people say, there's a cliche of like when you start a business, it takes 5 years to make a profit. It's like a similar thing in podcasting. It takes a couple years of consistent releases and promotion to get any traction there. But I don't want everyone to get overwhelmed with all the things I've been saying. So some actionable steps that you guys can start with right away is defining your podcast concept, brainstorming names. Like I said, that podcast generator tends to help. A lot of times I tell people to record a draft trailer just on their phone. Like you can just use your phone voice notes and record your script and listen back and see how it feels, share it with a few close friends. And then when you get to actually recording it, you'll be in a better place. And it just like makes you feel like you're starting. The other thing would be setting up your recording space. So a lot of people might have a basement or a spare bedroom or home office. Start to get it set up and it'll make you feel like you've started too. So those are just some tips on, feeling like you're getting started if you're, have been hesitant or not know where to start. Those are some things you can do right away. All right. I did want to mention that I have referenced this a bunch of times, but our blog and YouTube channel has a bunch of really great, very in-depth resources for gear recommendations, for studio setups, for growth strategies, how to get the best quality, audio and video and lighting. And then it also has all of our webinars on the YouTube channel. So make sure to check out our blog and YouTube channel. And those will be linked in the follow-up email that we will send. It will also include today's recording of the webinar. So you have that to look forward to, in less than 24 hours after we finish today. All right. And so thank you guys so much for joining us. We can take some questions now. So I'm going to open up the chat. And if I don't get to any of your questions today, feel free to email me. Like I said, I'm just Robert at the Podcast Consultant, and hopefully I can answer any questions that you have then. All right, so I'll see what we have in the Q&A here. What is a good mic you recommend, preferably USB? That's from Samuel. Thanks for the question. So, like I said, there is a lot of really good recommendations, and they get very specific depending on what you are looking for, like on our blog posts. So make sure to check that out. It really depends on your budget. Like what I have been recommending as of late, there's on the lower end of the budget, I think it's like about 60 or $70. It's called the Samson Q2U. And it's basically a similar mic. It's basically modeled after the Shure SM58, which if you guys have ever been to a concert, you have ever seen a lead singer, they're always using an SM58. It's kind of like the workhorse of not only podcasting, but of music and just like the best vocal mic of all time, basically. So it's basically modeled off that. And it's set up as a USB mic. So it actually comes with a little stand similar to what I have here. It's very light. And so like you can take it with you, you can just throw it in a backpack. And then, yeah, you just plug it into your laptop and you're good to go. And it's a pretty good modeling as far as like the cardioid pattern that SM58 has. So follow up with me if you want any more details on that, but I would definitely try the Samson Q2U, it's called. All right, I have Keith is asking a question here. All these tips sound like they apply if you are rebranding an existing show. Any tips regarding that? Yes, that's a great question. So actually, a lot of people who do launches with us are actually relaunching or rebranding their show. So I would definitely say one of the big things is moving to Spotify for creators and starting up video if you haven't already. What you're doing is kind of like riding the coattails of Spotify, who is really trying its best to get more market share from YouTube. Right now, YouTube is like by far the biggest platform for video podcasts, just because people know, that's where you go to see video content. So that's a really big one. Any of the branding things, as far as like the visual branding, is really important. A lot of people are refreshing their logos. Sometimes they'll just have the biggest cliche that I see all the time is just a picture of a microphone as your podcast cover art and then the name of the podcast. That's a big mistake in my opinion, because it's just people aren't going to look at that. They're just going to be like, it's too generic. Like, what does that even start to imply? So definitely the cover art is a big thing. And then episodic cover art. People aren't usually doing episodic cover art. They usually will just use the default image, which is going to be your podcast cover art. So that's a big one. And then especially if you are doing video podcasts, to do thumbnails, to be really specific about how you create and design your thumbnails to make them as attention grabbing as possible. There are a lot of different things that we've talked about today that we could go into, but feel free to reach out to me, Keith, and I'm happy to have a discussion via email, and I can give you more tips and tricks depending just on where you're at. So thanks for the question. We have another one here from Kelly. How many episodes should you have in the can before going live? Does the scheduled frequency going matter? Meaning, is it a number of episodes or a number of weeks/months? Okay, I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I think that's something I didn't talk about enough. Like I was saying about the solo episode thing, it's nice to have those in your back pocket in case anything happens with guests canceling or whatever. What's really, really important when you're launching your show is to have at least like 4 to 5 episodes if you can, in the can, completely edited, completely finished before you go to launch. Because if you are trying to stick, especially to like a weekly or a bi-weekly cadence, it's going to be really hard for you to find the time, especially if podcasting is not your full-time job or vocation. It's going to be really hard to find time to get caught up. So like every week you're going to have a deadline, and the deadline is going to start to be stressful. And the more that you think about that deadline, the more you don't want to do your podcast. So it's really a great idea to have 5 to 6 episodes ready before you go. And it kind of depends on whether you're going weekly or monthly, but I would is a really good idea. So thank you for bringing that up. It's a really good question. I think it's something that people miss when they start with their podcast. They're like, okay, I have one episode out or I have one episode finished. Let's just put it out. And then they have to, scramble and rush to get the next week's episode out. I would say also, like related to that, one of the biggest bottlenecks for people is the production and editing. A lot of people don't realize how much time and effort. So I think that's a big reason why people um, don't think about that is because they don't hear anything edited. But that's because that's the editors doing their job. So a lot of times people have just come to a service like us for like, I can't spend 8 hours, learning how to edit a podcast and then have it come out not as good as I wanted it. It's usually just better in some people's situation if their budget can afford it to just pay for professional podcast editing. And it also makes the time and effort that you're putting into the show overall a lot less. And then that kind of relieves some tension for you. So if you still do have that deadline, you're not having to spend an entire day editing your episode. You're just sending it off and it comes back how you want it. You can always make revisions and go back and forth. So that's a big one of our clients' demographics is people who are just like, they love doing the podcast. They just don't have the time to sit and edit it or even learn how to do the editing. So I think that's an important thing to say. Um, and it looks like we got one more question here from Samuel, but if anyone else has questions, please put it in the chat. We still have some time. Samuel asks, what are some other places you recommend for royalty-free music? I do think Envato is the best because, like I said, it had that feature where you can basically copy and paste a song that you like, and then they'll give you royalty-free options. There also is so like Pond 5 has a similar thing where they will have like a lot of sound alikes, right? So you can type in like the name of a U2 song and it will be in the keyword, and so you can find something similar that way. Premium Beats is really good. I would say it kind of that's kind of the majority of what they do, but they do a really good job of that. So I would say if you're looking for that kind of like lo-fi, electronic, hip hop instrumental sound, they do a really good job there. It also just depends on what you need because like Pond 5 and Envato both have like also stock footage for like if you're producing video podcasts, and then stock photos if you want to use anything like that in your episodic cover art. So it really just kind of depends. But I think Envato is really great overall and probably the best. It's also unlimited, so you're basically paying monthly, and then you can download as many, songs as you want. So it just really depends on your use case. But I think those are all pretty good. All right, we have one final question we'll have time here for. This is from Lori. I'm working in investigative journalism and often have to record phone calls or in-person conversations that would get used in the podcast later. Any thoughts on best practices for recording? Is phone quality or is iPhone quality or Zoom good enough? Let's see. That's a really good question. There is a variety of different like iPhone apps that will basically record directly from your call. That's one way to do it. Zoom gets you a decent quality, but if you can get someone to use Riverside versus Zoom, Riverside is a much better recording platform for podcasting. Um, so basically, it records locally to your computer and then it automatically uploads it. So if, say, there's like internet interruptions or anything, it won't record those because it's just recording from the person's phone or their computer directly so that you don't have any of those interruptions. There are also really good and affordable digital recorders nowadays. So you can get a handheld battery operated digital recorder that's about the size of an iPhone. And you can hook up microphones to it specifically. So, like if you want to do a quick interview with somebody in the field, but you can also hook up your phone directly to it. So you can actually put headphones into the digital recorder, and then you hook your phone up into the digital recorder. So you're listening to the phone call through headphones, and then you're speaking on, kind of on speakerphone, and then you get a really clean digital recording of the other end of the phone call. Um, what I would do in so that you get really high quality voice on your end, and then you get more of a phone quality on their end just because they are on a phone. But it's going to be much higher quality than if you're using one of those iPhone apps. But Laura, if you want to email me after, I can give you some specific recommendations about apps and about digital recorders. But they're all pretty affordable, like $100 even can get you a nice one. Yeah. So let's see. Think we're just about out of time, and it looks like that was the last question, anyways. So yeah, I want to thank all of you guys for joining us. And like I said, a lot of the things I talked about, we will send a follow-up that has like a lot more details. There's also a lot more details and nuance and guidance in on our YouTube channel and then on our blog page. So make sure to just go to our website and check out what we have. And then, like I said, feel free to reach out to me if you have specific questions I didn't get to today, or even down the line once you start your show, if you have any other questions. Just reach out to me. It's just Robert at thepodcastconsultant.com. You can also just email podcast at thepodcastconsultant.com, and we'll try to get back to you with whatever specific information you need. But yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and hopefully it was helpful for you guys. And if there's anything else you need, please reach out to us. We're happy to work with you, and we're always happy to get new clients for any of the services we do, which is full service, remote recording, editing, producing, kind of everything. We can do whatever you're looking for. So please feel free to reach out. And thanks again for joining us.